Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
We naturally assume that Holocaust museums and research centers are about what happened to the Jews during World War II. Yet, recently many of these institutions, originally founded and funded by Holocaust survivors, have either dismissed or become hostile to the Jewishness of the Holocaust. Today we have with us as our guest Joshua Blustein, a lawyer in the Miami office of Sidley Austin. He has a special interest in preserving the history of the Nazi determination to eradicate all European Jews. Joshua, welcome to our show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So let's start with you're sharing with us what you're seeing happening recently at Holocaust museums and research centers.
Yeah, so there is a troubling tendency which has eroded much of the specifically Jewish focus of these institutions that were originally founded to study and to research and to honor the Holocaust memory. So you see this right off the bat in just the naming of these institutions, which all were founded with the names of Holocaust only in the name. But in the last few years, we've seen a real dilution. So just to show a few examples of a much larger problem throughout the world, just in New York and New Jersey, of the 13 Holocaust research centers in those two states, 11 have by now changed their names to add either and genocide or Holocaust and human rights. Only two actually still maintain just the Holocaust name. But that is just the tipping point. When you look inside these institutions, we're seeing a similar worrying trend. So again, if you just go to the Holocaust Museum website for the museum in Melbourne, Australia, you can't even access the website unless you click something that pops up that you acknowledge that the museum sits on the historic lands of a certain Aboriginal tribe. So right off the bat, the point is clearly we're focusing on something else, or that the meaning of the Holocaust is somehow tied to these other things. So you can't even step in the door without that happening. And it's the same thing at the Sydney Holocaust Museum in Australia. And you see this so those are just before you even get in the door. And you see the name, and before you can even enter in, they're already hitting you with the messaging. But when you start to scratch a little deeper, you see that the actual message is similar. So for one example, at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, they have what they have now called the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. So they have a list of their past programs that dates back to 2018. And I looked through that itinerary, and there is not a single one related to the Holocaust exclusively. But it's even worse than that. This same center, though they don't have anything to do with the Holocaust, has several dedicated to bashing Israel. So you have one which was called, quote, 1948, A Global History. Another one, quote, Race, Indigeneity, Settler Colonialism in Global Perspective. And the course description for that one is that it, quote, discusses whether Israel should be characterized as a settler colonial state. So what we see now is that while some of them may just ignore the main focus, some of them are actually dedicated specifically to in some sort of propaganda against the Jews, as opposed to their memory. And we'll get into why that is. And just to paint it a little bit more, so we've seen recently in the news, Whoopi Goldberg on The View said not that long ago that the Holocaust involved, quote, just two groups of white people in a way that doesn't matter, or the Jews almost deserved it, or doesn't, or it's nothing. So just to give one final example to put the feather on the cap is at the Sonoma State University's Holocaust and Now Genocide Center,
which is in California.
Which is in California. They proudly write on their website that it was created originally, quote, for the purpose of providing education about the origins, nature, and consequences of the Holocaust. But they proudly proclaim that in recent years, they've, quote, broadened and expanded its focus to include the study of issues surrounding other historical and modern genocides. And then on the list of what their purpose is, it's, quote, designed to honor survivors and victims of the genocides committed throughout the world, including the Native American genocide, the Armenian genocide, the Jewish Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, and the current day genocide in Darfur, end quote. So this just is, this just lays the groundwork for the fact that these institutions are, by and large, either they're Holocaust light, or they're Holocaust plus, or they're just purely politically motivated in sometimes ways against the Jews, which is crazy to see. So we'll discuss why that is. But I think it's important to note that this isn't a recent phenomenon. This isn't just a last 5 years woke phenomenon. This has been going on for a very long time. In fact, in December of 1990, Lucy Davidovitz, the famous Holocaust scholar who wrote the book The War Against the Jews, she wrote an article in Commentary magazine 4 days before she died, where she studied the Holocaust curricula in various states throughout the United States. And what she found was exactly what I'm describing. So she wrote in that article, which I recommend that you could find online, she wrote, quote, that the current curricula, quote, generalize the highly particular nature and history of anti-Semitism by subsuming and camouflaging it under general rubrics like scapegoating, prejudice, and bigotry. So that is the state of affairs of Holocaust education. And so we'll get into how that developed, why that is, who's pushing it, and what's the motives behind it.
So, Joshua, could you give us some more examples of Holocaust museums or research centers that are dedicated to bashing Israel?
So I don't have the list on me now, but from what I've seen, especially at universities, especially the ones at universities, these when it comes to like genocide studies, a lot of these professors are very anti-Israel, and so I can supply a list soon after this interview. But it's almost like when you see sociology or you see some of these other fields in academia that are very, very tied to animus towards Israel, like genocide studies is in that mix. So the research assistants and the PhD candidates who are in these fields tend to be very aligned against Israel. And it's not, and I think as we'll get into, it's not by chance. There's a very clear correlation between the two.
Yeah, well, this is a little bit off the spine of what we had said we were talking about, but what do you think is the real risk? I mean, I know it, my answer would be, I know what Evelyn's answer would be, but the real risk of totally forgetting the Jews in the Holocaust in terms of for the understanding of what happened to the Jews and making sure it never happens again, this dilution, what's the real risk?
Right. So the real risk is that I think the Holocaust is first of all unique, and anti-Semitism is not like it's not the same as these other instances, which is something I do want to discuss. It's not just that they're ignoring the Jews; they're making comparisons that aren't right. I mean, the Holocaust is not the Armenian genocide. They're just completely different. So it's like, what's the point of studying anything if you can't distinguish between different historical instances? It's like if you have a Revolutionary War museum for the 1776, and you just include I don't know, Israel's independence in there and say, well, they both fought against Britain for independence. Yeah, but the causes, the origins, what was the impact, who was involved? I mean, they're just completely different. So it's like you're just not even thinking at that point. You're just like making very broad, just make a war museum and put every war that's ever been, that's ever had. it's not serious. And of course, I think the classic thing, or if you don't understand anti-Semitism, you're certainly bound to see it rear its head. And I think part of what this is, some of it, as we'll discuss, is animus. There are certain groups of people or ideologies that want to remove the Holocaust from focus, or to remove the Jews or current day Jews as connected to it. But then it's also largely just a function of they don't understand the phenomenon of the Holocaust, of anti-Semitism, and it just comes from pure ignorance.
So
Evelyn?
why do you think this is happening in Holocaust education? Why,
So
why
I
the
think
willingness to declare Israel as a settler colonial state?
so that I'll get to last. I'll start with what is, I think, the most beneficial, or respectful way to approach this is the people who aren't malicious. So that's with people who just misunderstand the Holocaust or misunderstand anti-Semitism. And what they try to do often, as you see this not just with the Holocaust, but with modern study of history, is they'll try to square our current view of things with the round peg of the past. So in a great book called The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism by Walter LaCour, it's right here. It's a great book. And he describes how a lot of the people who try to try to fit the Holocaust into their ideological pretext tend to do that because they don't actually understand the Holocaust. So he on page 32, he talks about the Frankfurt School, which actually had a lot of Jews in it. But when he talks about how they tried to define the Holocaust through their socialist view of materialism, but he writes how when they're in their writings, they don't know the history of the Jews. They don't really grasp the history of what happened. So they just misunderstand it, and they try to fit it into their preconceived notions. And in Lucy Dawidowitz's article, she also describes how in a lot of these school curriculums in the 90s, there just had blatant errors, which is very clear that they derived from American understandings of religion and race that happened in the 1990s. So she writes about how one of them in the California History Social Science Framework, it wrote in there, quote, to engage students in thinking about why one of the world's most civilized nations participated in the systematic murder of millions of innocent people, mainly because of their religious identity. I mean, that's obviously not the case. You could have been a converted Catholic if you had it was not a religious identity was the problem, right? That had nothing to do with it. We know how many converted Jews in the Lodz Ghetto I studied, how there was a church in the ghetto for Jews who had converted out. It was a racial thing. It was a political thing. It was certainly not because of religious identity. But if you're an American living in the 1990s, you see the various religious organizations as a religious identity. You can move from one to the other. But that's not how Nazi Germany worked. You don't jump from identity to identity. So part of it is just a total misunderstanding of what's happening. It's not, and this isn't malicious. It's just a lack of true. It's just lack of true knowledge. And I think also part of it is what I alluded to a little earlier, which is that they fail to distinguish between various things, and they almost blindly just look at, oh, there are a lot of dead bodies in one case, and in another case, they must be similar. They must both be genocides. And in Dawidowitz's article, she describes how in the way that some of these states define genocide, there was no way it was so unclear. Some of them didn't even include murder. It was just if you harm a specific group of people, that's genocide. So the word itself is hard to wrap your head around. But just to focus on this, because I think this is a very critical point. Let's say you'll see them join together the Holocaust against the Jews, and then also the fact that the Nazis killed, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses. But the program of the Nazis vis-a-vis the Jews and Jehovah's Witnesses were completely separate. The war against the Jews was a war of extermination. At the Wannsee Conference, they drew up a list of all the world's Jews. They tried to track down every Jew. No one was exempt. Whereas Jehovah's Witnesses was a political thing. Because Jehovah's Witnesses are pacifists and refuse to join in a war, they were seen as draft dodgers. And yes, they were sent to concentration camps, but they were in separate areas of the camp, and they were not subject to mass extermination. If they said, okay, I give up Jehovah's Witnesses, I'll join the war, or I'm not going to be against Nazism, they were released. So they're totally different. Even the groups like the Roma, the Gypsies, who were subject to serious exterminations by the Nazis. Even the Roma, there were areas in which the Nazis kind of didn't care what they left them alone and didn't really do anything to them.
Yeah,
So
well, the Nazis didn't see them as suspects of taking over the world, and they did see them.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
That's exactly right. And as we'll get into, what the people don't understand is that anti-Semitism, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, is truly it's a political phenomenon. It's not a social one. In our world, in America, we see it through the lens of maybe social injustice. You say you're mean to somebody, or you harbor a personal bias against a particular group, or you're xenophobic. That's not what anti-Semitism is. I'll touch that in a second. But I want to make one big thing, because even the Armenian genocide, which is always seen as a kind of a corollary, and by the way, even in the Lodz Ghetto, some of the diarists write about how they see what's happening to them as similar to the what happened to the Armenians by the hands of the Ottomans. But there were large swaths of the Ottoman Empire where the Armenians were left alone. It was only, I believe, in the East where the Armenian genocide happened. Western Armenians in the Western Ottoman Empire were left alone. So, point is, anti-Semitism, and the title of the book by Lucy Davidovitz of The War Against the Jews, that's what this is. It's a total war and this is how the anti-Semites defined it, which was that we are in a battle for existence. Either we destroy them fully to every last Jew, or they will round us up and kill all of us. It's not, yeah.
Joshua, could you elaborate a little bit on the malicious, what you would call the malicious efforts to
Yes.
de-Judaize the Holocaust?
Exactly. So I just wanted to talk about the other one, because that's probably most people who misunderstand things, or people who work at the Holocaust museums, I don't think are malicious. Most of them are just misguided, and there's kind of a multicultural view of the world, which all things are kind of related and each cultures are the same. So the way that we approach hate and xenophobia is in the same way that they did. They don't see it in the terms of a political destiny, or like war against the Jews, or as the founder of the word anti-Semitism, Wilhelm Marr, put it in 1879, the victory of Judaism over Germandom. That kind of clash of civilizations is just not the way that we see race. And the way Americans never saw race, even like the most classically American racist track, which is, let's say, like the Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy. Read that, and then read Wilhelm Marr's 1879 victory of the Jews over Germandom. They're just not in the same ballpark. They're just different ways of approaching it. They're both horrible, but one is they're just different. One is so I'll let you read it for yourself, but I think I made the point. Now let's get to your question of who are the malicious people. So from right away, right after the Holocaust ended in 1945, the Soviets had a clear program to downplay the Holocaust vis-a-vis the Jews, and to turn it exclusively into a fascist attack on Soviets. That it was an attempt by the fascists, by the West, by the capitalists, to dominate and take over the Soviet Union. So you see this if you look at old Soviet memorials at mass shooting sites or ghettos and camps. Some of them have changed now, but originally they make no mention of the Jews whatsoever. They're just, here died 30,000 workers or Soviet citizens. No mention of the Jews. And this, of course, goes into the root of Soviet anti-Semitism, or the Soviet anti-Zionism, and their desire to clamp down on Jewish self-identification and things like that. And I saw this also. This went on for a very long time, because there's a Lodz Ghetto diary of a boy named David Sirkowiak. And I know that I collaborated with the guy who had the diaries, the original manuscripts in Polish, but he couldn't publish it in the late Soviet Union in the 80s and the 90s because they wouldn't allow it because it's a very Jewish work. The guy, he's a Jew, he talks about Jewish life in the ghetto, so they wouldn't even allow it to be published. So there is the for much of the 20th century, there was a Soviet effort to make sure that the Holocaust was spoken about in the broadest of terms and to totally ignore the Jewish aspect of it. And of course, as we know, the far left in America today and around the world very much is the inheritor of the Soviet view of the world and its attempts its attempts to see the world in its image. And the oppressor-oppressed narrative that we hear so much about, that having someone who just left law school and was exposed to that narrative a great deal, this also very much boggles the minds of these socialist oppressor-oppressed narrative people. And this is kind of what Whoopi Goldberg was touching upon, because in their view, Jews are the great capitalists. They are the oppressors. They're the ones who run the businesses. And you see this in some of the polling that's come out about how young people today view Jews. Something like 70% of them see Jews as oppressors. So it bogs their mind a little bit that they don't understand how these oppressors could have been so oppressed. And that it's somewhat linked to like the far right Nazi Holocaust denial that like in the 70s and 80s was a big deal, because in their mind, the Jews run everything. It's a much more extenuated situation where they think that the Jews run the banks and they run all the governments, right? The Zionist owned governments, the ZOGs, and that every decision is run by the Jews. So if the Jews are actually the ones who are puppeteering all of the world governments, how could it possibly be that they were taken totally by surprise and all the other governments conspired to kill them? So in that sense, they don't know what to do, so they come up with this. But I think part of what we're seeing today amongst these institutions and on these campuses, as I said, these Holocaust centers that are on campuses are the worst because they're most infected by this ideology, is the linkage also between how Israel and Zionism plays into this whole conversation. Because, of course, Israel sees itself very much in a response, and as the Jewish solution to the problem of Jewish statelessness and the Holocaust was to have a state. And for them, for the real anti-Zionists, they have a real issue with the fact that the Holocaust does lend credence to the notion that the Jews need a state. You'll see when people will say today, I heard it yelled at me when I was on campus, go back to Poland. Well, if you really believe that Poland was the site of the worst possible genocide in world history, well, then you wouldn't really say that. So part of their whole belief of Israel and Zionism is that Jews are natively European, that they are baked into the Ashkenazi culture is just fully European, that's where they belong, that's where they originated from. And so it doesn't really make sense to them that their homeland, that where they should be, was actually a horrible killing field for them, and that they were so ostracized and so not part of the native. They weren't Poles, they weren't Germans, that they need to kind of push aside this narrative and the focus on anti-Semitism, and they need to broaden it. So Ruth Weiss, the former Yiddish professor, she has a really interesting speech that she gave called "The Dark Side of Holocaust Education," and she talks about how when she went to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. And asked if they had any books in their store about anti-Semitism, they said that they don't, because they don't want to have anything political. So this is somewhat of the narrative, which is anti-Semitism is political. It steps on some people's toes. It the true nature of the Holocaust does implicate certain problems of the present, which is Israel, which a lot of people would want to ignore. But also the fact of that Hitler, yes, was a great molder of anti-Semitic conspiracies, but it only could have taken off it only took off because of the hundreds of years of deep Christian anti-Semitism that was baked into the psyche of the European peoples. So you also have to deal with, there's a little bit of an uncomfortableness with amongst Christians. If you really teach it the way that I'm talking about, and you want to get to the roots of anti-Semitism, you have to discuss the long, deep roots of Christian anti-Semitism, which again is something that people don't want to do. So those are some of the reasons. Now, there's another main reason, which is in recent years has become much more of a factor, which is the Arab and Muslim antipathy towards the Holocaust, towards the Jews, and certainly towards Israel. So you see very early on, even in the early 1950s, the Lebanese foreign minister, Charles Malik, already by then, this is only a few years after the Holocaust, he's already saying that the Jews fabricated the Holocaust for Zionist ends. And even in 1977, when New York puts out one of its first robust Holocaust educations, the leader of the American Arab Relations Committee, MT Mehdi, he wrote that, quote, he said that this attempt to teach the Holocaust in schools was, quote, an attempt by the Zionists to use the city educational system for their evil propaganda purposes. So, and of course we know Ahmadinejad, former president of Iran, was openly a denier of the Holocaust. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, his PhD from the University of Moscow is all about Holocaust denial. The Article 22 of the Hamas original charter openly denies the Holocaust and says that the Jews actually were the inflictors of the great evils of the both world wars and that they profited from the World War. So because now you've seen a convergence between the Middle Eastern view of these things, and that's certainly had a much more powerful role and influence on campuses today, where a lot of these thoughts come from. All of these things together create including just general, more liberal, multicultural views that doesn't want to get into the specifics of why cultures are different, why hatred in one place could be different than hatred in another, why anti-Semitism could be different than, let's say, racist hate in the United States. They like to just put everything together. So you have that multicultural view, you have the long history of Soviet propaganda, you have the oppressor-oppressed narrative, and which dovetails with the anti-Zionism, and you have now a very loud Middle Eastern, Muslim, and Arab open Holocaust denial. I mean, that is really where Holocaust denial is at its most open. They at one deny the Holocaust and also laud the Holocaust. Right? They'll say how great Hitler was throughout the Middle East, and then also say that the Holocaust didn't happen. So they play both sides. But the truth,
So downplaying or denying or downplaying the Holocaust as genocide on the Jews, it became part of the delegitimization of Israel, I think, right? Which
absolutely.
was unheard of maybe till 10, 15 years ago to delegitimize Israel. But today it became very fashionable to do it and to say that the Holocaust didn't happen or that there are other genocides that are as bad, and especially the genocide on the Palestinians, quote unquote, all plays into the narrative of delegitimizing Israel, I think.
That's exactly
Do you
right. That's
agree?
exactly right. And part of what's happening is, of course, as you said, in the last 10 years, the delegitimization of Israel has become much more prominent. And part of
Fashionable, even. Could we say fashionable?
and fashionable, which, by the way, the word you just used the word fashionable. So what's the most important thing to realize is that and this is what LaCour says in this book. It's what Davidovich says. It's also what Ruth Weiss says. So all three people talking about it have the same point, which is it's very critical to realize that anti-Semitism is a political phenomenon, not a social one. It is the view that your view of the world and of the essence and purpose of politics is to war against the Jews. That is different than all the sorts of hate. And so the reason, so you said the word fashionable. So it always used to be that in German it was called Judenhass, Jew hate, or Judeophobia. That's you'll see that in Leon Pinsker's Auto-Emancipation, the word Judeophobia. But Wilhelm Marr, who I alluded to earlier, he says that we don't live in a, this is in the 1870s, we don't have such a religious society as much anymore. And the old Judenhass, the old Jew hate, was very much in the Jews killed Christ, that kind of traditional anti-Semitism. And what he says is we need a scientific, political, rational hatred of the Jews. So he writes this book called The Victory of Judaism Over Germandom, where it's a political tract. It discusses the conspiracy of the Jews' attempt to dominate the world and destroy it, and that the hatred of the Jews is not old style religious, xenophobia or bias. It's a rational political view of the fact that the Jews are out there to expand and to dominate the world and with bloodthirsty intentions. And so when Theodor Herzl writes a work that titled The Menorah, he starts, it's an autobiographical tale, and he talks about how there was once a Jew, he's talking about himself, who was not affiliated at all and didn't care about anything. But then the old Jew hate reemerged under a new fashionable slogan. And that's the main difference. And that's what we're seeing today, which is that when it continues to rebrand and it's political, and you could tie it to what's going on in international politics. That's what's very scary about the Israel situation, is that that's what it is. The Arab world, especially groups like Hamas, read their charter, they're like the Nazis in the sense that their view of politics is that it's the Jews coming to destroy them, and their only effort and only way to survive is to destroy the Jews. The fact that the Jews are out there to conquer the world, and that's the kind of thing that you don't see 1940s segregationists saying about blacks. This is a different phenomenon, and it has to be taught as such. But the research centers and the Holocaust museums are not doing that. And another thing that they're not doing is talking about the legacy of anti-Semitism and what happened in 1945. All the anti-Semites just poofed out. They were so motivated. But then once they saw what happened, everyone just kind of fiddled out. What happened to the Nazis who weren't caught and killed? Do we know that a lot of them moved into the Arab world, or that that Nazi broadcasts that were being delivered in Arabic from Zisin by that was led by the Mufti of Jerusalem, and anti-Semitic Nazi theory spread throughout the Arab world, and now is there anywhere in the world where Hitler and actual Nazi material is consumed and appreciated more than against the current enemies of Israel and in the Arab street? So they don't, that's important about the politics and the fashionable slogan thing. It's that people love dead Jews, as Darrell Horn wrote. It's very easy to say, yeah, well, of course we're sad about the Jews of the past, and we honor them, and it was so terrible. But there's a current war against the Jews. You have full countries dedicated to their destruction, and they're openly peddling Nazi materials. I mean, the IDF always finds Mein Kampf translated into Arabic in children's homes in the West Bank and in Gaza. So the legacy of that, the war against the Jews isn't over. It's accelerated, and we have Israel now to ward itself off. But it's very easy to look in hindsight and say, oh yeah, we feel bad for the persecuted Jew, and that's also part of the negative effects of this education, which is all you're seeing are mass graves and skin and bones bodies, as opposed to what
So,
about the Jews of today, the ones who are
so,
resolute, the descendants of the Holocaust survivors who have reconstituted themselves and defend themselves and fight against all this stuff. That is
so
where
what,
the focus needs to go.
so what, yeah. So what you're saying, if I understand you well, is Holocaust museums and research centers, a lot of them, tend to broaden the Holocaust to non-Jewish victims of other genocides, um, or the lessons of the Holocaust, or similarities to the Holocaust, but they don't include what is the signs of a disaster happening to the Jews today. Um, that are similar to how the Holocaust started. Is that correct?
That's a great point. That's exactly right. And it's always what I always love to see is what I find interesting is everyone agrees now that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was justified. When I was at University of Chicago Law School during the whole October 7th situation, one of the radical anti-Israel groups put out a statement that October 7th and those who perpetrated it were like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising fighters. Okay, so this also plays into, again, the need to delegitimize to break the chain between Israel, the Jews, and the Holocaust. If the Holocaust is not a Jewish thing at all, if somehow those who massacre the Jews are actually the inheritors of the Holocaust, then that breaks Israel's reason of existence. It breaks the Jews' claim to need a state. So that there's all that factor there. But the point is that even these people recognize that, of course, everyone agrees that the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto should have done an uprising. That was justified. But at the time, why didn't people think that? If you look at the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and their contacts with the Polish underground completely sold them out. They were opposed to the Jews uprising. They did not aid them. They openly thought, good, we have the writings of the Polish underground. Some of them say this is good because now the Nazis can just wipe them out. So in hindsight, once the Jews are dead, everyone's happy with, oh yes, of course we feel bad for them. Oh yes, of course that was the right thing to do. Of course, we stand with you. But when the Jews themselves are alive and fighting for their existence, then everyone is looking around. No one wants to step on anybody's toes. It's political. That's how everything goes. And the lesson of the Holocaust is not we should feel bad for mass graves, because of course, yes, we should feel bad for mass graves. That's why you feel bad about the mass graves of Cambodia and of Rwanda. That's easy. But the thing about the Holocaust, why no one stepped up at the time, why country after country fell to the anti-Semitic theories, or they just weren't strong enough to say to Hitler, we're not going to round up our Jews, which was simple to do. Honestly, like when the king of Bulgaria said, no Bulgarian citizen will be taken, the Jews of Bulgaria were totally saved. And Bulgaria was not a strong country. King Boris did not have much at his disposal. But country after country said, oh, we don't want to get we don't want to get involved. Germany's going to be upset. This political situation where we have claims on this mountaintop, and Germany will help us get it. And all these political reasons at the time why, the Jews deserve what they're getting. And then in hindsight, we'll go to the museums. We'll feel bad for them because it's easy to feel bad for everybody. You tell me to feel bad for a massacre that happened during the Crusades. Yeah, sure. Anyone will say, yeah, that was bad. Why not? There's no skin off your back. But the lesson of the Holocaust, the whole thing, never again. Those who stay quiet, it's as if they perpetrated it themselves. All those lessons of being strong and standing up have to be connected to the anti-Semitism of today, when we're seeing the exact same thing, when it is uncomfortable, when it is fashionable to be against the Jews, when it's not. That is where it counts. And unfortunately, we're being sold by these Holocaust educators just a watered down, bland, don't hate, be sweet, don't listen to anybody because people are corrupt, and just kind of listen to yourself and do your own thing. That's not the moral courage that needs to be taught. And unfortunately, we're seeing that repetition today.
Yes, well, we could go on for hours, but we only have a few more minutes. So here's the important thing. What can you tell our listeners about what we can do about this watered down Holocaust education, in which many of our listeners will, and rightly so, I think, give donations to these museums in their hometowns, etc., but not pay a lot of attention and maybe not even go to the programs? What can individuals do?
That's the big question. And I think that part of it is just letting people know. I was shocked about these things when I first started digging into it. And part of it is we still control, like the Jews are still the ones involved in these organizations. We're the ones who give the money and the endowments. We just need to start asking some questions. Say to somebody, what is the Israel programming at this Holocaust museum? How are you connecting, how are you teaching the dangers of anti-Semitism? That's not just a general don't hate, as we said, that's not going to get the job done. The actual history and political theories of what anti-Semitism is. How are you talking about combating anti-Semitism today? And how much and just openly say, how much of your seminars and workshops are dedicated to non-Holocaust related materials. And we just need to stand up and just say something. A lot of these things, as we've seen at the university level throughout the last year and a half, is that a lot of what happens goes on because no one's looking under the hood. Everyone is trusting these institutions and not putting their thumb on the scale. Unfortunately, that's what happened in the university for the last 50 years. Every university has that I lived in at Johns Hopkins and at UChicago. Every dorm room has a Jewish name. Every building, the Jews are just continuing to give the money to these places, and they don't know what's going on. So we just need to take stock of what's happening and be annoying and say, I'm sorry, but I want to make sure that this is going to be going the way I think it is. Talking to the educators and bringing up these points, having them read Lucy Davidovich's article and saying, are you falling prey to the same thing that she's talking about? And unfortunately, it's just going to take being annoying. And otherwise, we're going to see the Holocaust become as we're already seeing it become a political issue. We saw that there were riots outside the Holocaust Museum in LA, anti-Israel riots. So protesting the Holocaust Museum. So we're already seeing it go that way. And that's the warning sign that we better check ourselves and see what our strategy is. Because when we go without a strategy, those who are more politically structured and organized will beat us. And that's my message is it's kind of like a wake up, let's get into action. And let's start sending emails and calling and saying, I listened to this podcast. I'm very concerned. What's going on here? Is there anything like this happening at the museum that I give money to, or that I'm a docent at, or that I'm involved in? We need to be very serious because this is a serious issue.
I just want to say one thing because without mentioning which organization, I have tried to get more Holocaust organization programs at something that I belong to. One of the easiest things, I have a marketing mantra, which is make it as easy as possible for your target audience to say yes to you. So when you call these museums Holocaust centers, instead of just saying, what are you doing about the Holocaust? Say something like, I would really like a program about the Lodz Ghetto and what we can learn. And I know Joshua Blustein can speak about it. Or I'd really like a program about blah, blah, blah. Give them ideas because literally in many cases, they have no idea of what they could do. So by and saying, I'll help get the program, let's be even more proactive.
100%, 100%. And the sad thing is that those who have studied the history of anti-Semitism know that this is not a very unexpected development. And even in the Lodz Ghetto itself, we have one of the diaries, the diarist writes, he says that he understands that, I have it right here. It's a great quote, or I can't find it.
Who's
But
the
the quote
diarist?
is, the diarist is might be Poznansky. I'm not sure. I'll find
Okay,
it. But
no,
the
it's
quote,
okay. Go ahead.
but
Go
the
ahead.
quote is that the world will forget what happened to us. They will give us their condolences. They will give us their bromides or their worthless, oh, we feel sorry for you. But it's going to come to us, the Jews, to appropriately remember what happened, to dedicate ourselves to the memory of those who were lost, and to remember the real reasons why this happened. And so it's not a surprise that these institutions have fallen, have given up or lost their true mission, some of them. And this was already anticipated in the Holocaust, because, of course, they were getting some of this stuff from the outside. As the Jews were being pulled away from their homes, oh, we're so sorry to see you go, but they didn't mean it. And they left the Jews to their own devices. So it is up to our own devices. We have to figure it out ourselves. And we had it for so good for so long that we allowed ourselves to become complacent. But now we're realizing that the battle is back and we need to get on it. And thankfully, the two of you are on it. That's why you're thinking about these issues and having me on and discussing it. And this is how it starts. And hopefully this is not where it ends.
Thank you for those words. Yes. And we thank you, Joshua, so much for coming on. We thank our listeners, and I hope they're just not going to be listeners, but activists. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And please, please, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.